Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Stavrula. I am the Adult Services Program Coordinator at Indian Trails Library. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Tonight's program is part of Civic Spotlight, which is our monthly program series aimed at engaging our community around current events and issues of social concern. Last month, we heard from a letter carrier with the U.S. Postal Service about recent changes and controversies impacting mail service, including the potential impact on the November election. And tonight, we're going to dig in to the impact of COVID-19 on our election process more broadly. Our speaker tonight is Tyler St. Clair. He is the Outreach Manager for Common Cause Illinois. Common Cause is a nonprofit and nonpartisan organization that advocates for voting rights and other issues impacting democracy in the US political process. Tyler is going to tell us about the impact that COVID-19 had on the Illinois primary way back in March and how that turned into advocacy to protect the general election in November. So let's welcome Tyler.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Stavrula. Let me get my screen set up here. I feel a little bad that you already had a letter carrier on, as I have a few slides of the Postal Service, so hopefully I'm not being too repetitive in my content, but it's an important topic, so it probably bears repeating. Again, good evening, everybody. My name is Tyler St. Clair. I am the Outreach Manager with Common Cause Illinois. And I just want to give another quick thanks to Stavrula and the Indian Trails Public Library for having me on tonight to talk about safe, secure, and accessible elections, how we are protecting the right to vote during the COVID-19 pandemic. A quick introduction about myself and the organization. Stavrula touched on this a little bit. Again, my name is Tyler St. Clair. I'm the Outreach Manager here at Common Cause Illinois. Common Cause is a national organization with about 30 state chapters and offices in about 30 states. We focus on a variety of issues in sort of the good governance and democracy space, right? So think about gerrymandering and representation, money in politics, government ethics, and voting in elections, to name a few. And here in Illinois, we have a membership of about 40,000 people. So right now, our main focus, obviously between now and November 3rd, is voter education leading up to Election Day. So that includes what does COVID mean for election administration in the United States, how things are changing across the states and here in Illinois, and how we can prepare and what information you as voters need to know. So this is a admittedly content-heavy presentation. So, and I tend to be long-winded, so we'll just dive right in. One of the things Stavrula had mentioned a Q&A session as part of the presentation. Again, this is pretty content heavy, and so I like to just sort of go through and establish a rhythm as we go through different slides that I have and all the information to present to you. If at any point you think of a question, feel free to drop the question in the chat, and we'll leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the end where we can dive into all the questions that you have. And of course, if you think of something at the end, we'll dive into that too. So let's do a quick overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. So tonight, our goal here is to discuss a few things, right? So COVID-19's impact on the primary election here in Illinois. Obviously, this sort of set the stage for, one, what advocacy organizations would later end up doing as part of their work, and it's sort of informing what I'm doing now, right? Voter education to prepare for November. It also informed election administrators in how they could best prepare to host elections that were safe and secure and accessible. The next thing we want to talk about is what is vote by mail. After COVID-19's impact on our primary here in Illinois, the sort of silver bullet of policy proposals to address all of these public health concerns was vote by mail. So what I want to talk about tonight is, one, just what vote by mail is as a policy and as a system. And so what different states use that sort of falls under the umbrella of vote by mail. That ranges from universal vote by mail, like you have in Washington State, which I'm sure you've heard of, or Colorado and a few others, to excuse absentee states where you have to have an excuse to request an absentee ballot. So we'll dive into that as a system, sort of look at the wider spectrum of vote by mail policies and systems across the United States. The third thing is, what's happening at the state and federal level. Obviously, in Illinois, we passed Senate Bill 1863, Amendment 5, which included a host of election reforms to help us prepare for November. So we'll dive into that and what it means for you, the voter. And we'll also talk about issues at the federal level. This includes federal funding to help support our election administrators, as well as what's happening with the United States Postal Service. Next, we'll talk about the voter experience, right? What can you expect to experience when you either are requesting your ballot, when you are submitting your ballot by mail? Maybe you want to vote early, or you want to drop your ballot at a drop box, or maybe you just want to go vote in person on election day. We'll talk about all that and sort of the things that you can expect to see depending on how you decide to cast your ballot. And finally, as I said, we will open it for a Q&A session at the end. And again, as I said, if you have any questions as I go through a lot of this content, feel free to drop it in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer all of the questions in the allotted time that we have at the end of this presentation. So let's dive right in. So first topic that I want to discuss, COVID-19 and the Illinois primary. So in March, which doesn't seem that far past us, but I guess it was 5-6 months ago. What we saw here in Illinois, well, if you'll remember from the March primary, pictures like this seem to be the norm on primary day, right? Election judges and poll workers, hurriedly spraying down voting machines, trying to space people out within a polling location, trying to, make sure there are enough individual dispensable pencils they could hand out to people to, sign different documents, whatever. It was chaos, right? So Illinois had its first reported case of COVID-19 on January 24th from a traveler recently back from Wuhan, China. 6 weeks later, on March 8th, state officials suspected the first case of community transmission. The next day, March 9th, Governor J.B. Pritzker issued a disaster proclamation for the state. If you remember, Illinois was part of a group of 4 states that were scheduled to hold their primaries on March 17th, which included Arizona, Florida, Illinois, and Ohio. These states were in a very unique situation in terms of timing and the progress of COVID-19 here in the United States. For a lot of states that had held their primaries beforehand, COVID-19 wasn't as much in the public eye, wasn't considered as much of a public health risk in the United States. And so holding a primary, you didn't have those considerations to factor in how you were locating your polling places and how you were recruiting election judges. And again, following public health guidelines at polling locations. Are you spraying things down? Are you wiping them down enough? Do you have enough space? And if you were hosting a primary election after March 17th, a lot of those states had time to adjust their systems to prepare for these public health concerns, or delayed their primary elections to, again, give them enough time to adjust their systems to adapt to these public health concerns. So the 4 states that held their primaries on March 17th. Leading up to that date, news around COVID-19 and the risk it posed to public health and elections began to accelerate, leaving many to wonder if we should be holding primary elections at all, and if we did, how we could prepare for the public health risks associated with in-person voting. Ultimately, again, Illinois decided not to delay the primary, and voters headed to the polls on March 17th. Out of the 4 states I mentioned earlier, Florida, Arizona, and Illinois continued with their primaries. Ohio actually postponed them the night before with some actions from Governor Mike DeWine and Amy Acton, the director of the Ohio Department of Health. So prior to March 17th, election authorities in Illinois, particularly in Chicago and Cook County, reported a number of issues as they prepared to host in-person voting. First, a number of polling locations had to be relocated. For example, previous locations being inside buildings with high concentrations of at-risk populations, such as nursing homes. Over 170 sites were relocated, and even then, nearly 50 housing facilities for low-income seniors were used as polling locations on election day. In addition to polling places being relocated, many were closed on an emergency basis on the morning of March 17th. What election officials had seen as an increasingly worrying trend ended up coming true. Large numbers of poll workers didn't show up for their shifts or opted out of service beforehand at the last minute due to health concerns, which is understandable, right? And indeed, prior to election day, city and county election officials were pleading with healthy residents to volunteer as election judges, increasing the pay and waiving training requirements to fill the growing void in personnel. As a result, again, as I mentioned earlier, and is sort of depicted in this picture that was in the Chicago Sun-Times, mass chaos was the norm on election day. Hundreds of polling locations were moved or shuttered completely, leaving voters unsure of where they're supposed to cast their ballot. For those that could find their polling place, long lines and a lack of necessary PPE and cleaning supplies was a noted issue. So the Illinois primary happens. We see chaos in the city of Chicago and Cook County, across the state, in other states that were also holding their primaries in that day. And policymakers and election administrators and advocates alike are racking their brains thinking, what are we going to do if this is still present in November? How can we prepare? The silver bullet of a policy proposal that was suggested at the time was vote by mail. And I think that has, that general line of thinking sort of triumphed, right? Which is good. I think vote by mail does alleviate a lot of the concerns that we were having with the primary elections in Illinois and the other states on March 17th. So there's a general pursuit of increased accessibility for vote by mail policies here in Illinois. And so let's talk about what is vote by mail. Obviously, you're mailing your ballot, right? But what is it as a system? How does it work? How long have we been using it? And how many people have been using it? So casting a ballot by mail in the United States is not a new phenomenon. We've been doing it for a really long time. Casting a ballot by absentee actually began during the Civil War, as soldiers were allowed to vote from their battlefield units and have the ballot sent home to be counted. Again, during World War II, this became a major issue. Today, we actually have laws such as the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act and the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act. What started as a system for military/overseas citizens was later applied to non-military citizens if they were sick or traveling. However, it wasn't until the 1980s when California allowed citizens to request absentee ballots freely. One thing I want to mention here, and I'll dive into this a little bit later when we talk about issues at the federal level, but the United States Postal Service plays a huge role in making sure that election information is shipped out, that it's returned, that ballot requests are shipped out and returned, and that the ballots themselves are seen and returned. None of what we currently think of as voting by mail could happen without the United States Postal Service. Again, that's something we're going to dive into a little bit later, but when talking about how we vote by mail, you can't talk about it without talking about the Postal Service, right? So, how does casting a ballot by mail work? How does vote by mail work? The process varies from state to state, but there are some universal issues to consider. So election officials have to consider printing costs. They have to consider where they get their paper from, the cost of postage, both to and from, and is it prepaid? They have to think about the costs of supporting documents in your election mail, such as language requirement documents, a notice of the postage necessary to ship the ballot back. These ballots then have to be postmarked by a specific date and received by the election authority by a specific date. Finally, signatures must be verified. And these systems, signature verification systems, range from automated electronic systems with a centralized database to election judges checking each signature by hand. If an election worker thinks that there's a problem with a ballot or a signature, the cure process begins. Typically, this includes notifying the voter that they must report to their local election authority to correct the error, such as a signature mismatch. The timelines for signature cure processes vary, but in Illinois, voters have about 2 weeks. So again, there's a lot going on with how voting by mail works. And in some states, actually, a second signature is required, also known as a witness signature. And in other states, ballots, depending on your situation, are required to be notarized. So again, there's a lot of variation in how voting by mail actually works, depending on what state you're in. So let's look at the sort of state of the states. So this is a map of the United States, right, with data pulled from the Vote at Home Institute. If you've been reading anything about voting by mail, you have probably heard about the Vote at Home Institute. This is pared down from the level of detail that they use, but for the purposes of this presentation, sort of covers everything that we want to talk about. It's important to note here before I dive into specifics that a lot of the states that are depicted here as excuse absentee, that's sort of the light tan, light sand color, have waived a lot of the requirements for an excuse for their primary elections, or have just provided everyone with an automatic public health excuse when requesting a ballot. As of right now, this is interesting actually with news from today, there are still 6 states that are requiring an excuse to vote absentee in November. That's Indiana, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas. South Carolina's legislature today just passed a bill that would eliminate the need to have an excuse to vote absentee. So the governor has to sign it, so there's still another hurdle to jump there, but South Carolina could drop out of that list, and we could have 5 states that are still requiring an excuse. But interesting news there on a very timely topic, right? So, as you can see from this map, states exist on a spectrum when it comes to mail ballot implementation, like I mentioned before. But for the purposes of this presentation, there are 4 groups that states fall into, and 3 that we'll really dig into. So the first is universal vote by mail. You'll see that in the dark blue color. No excuse absentee with a permanent mail ballot option. Those are the teal colored states like California, Nevada, and Montana. Then you have no excuse absentee, which is the light green color. This is the category that Illinois falls into. And then excuse absentee, which I said is sort of the light tan or sand color. When talking about how we prepare for November, there was a larger discussion of should states between March and November fully transition to universal vote by mail. There are probably a few states that could realistically do this based on their current infrastructure and the amount of voters who participate in that system. Looking at this map, Arizona is a really good example of this. Montana, Nevada, also good ones. California, I think, has actually decided that they're going to host their elections in November entirely by mail. Virginia just this year actually passed legislation that included the permanent mail ballot option. So there are states that are close to being able to make that jump. But again, and as I'll discuss in the next couple slides, not every state has that ability. So let's talk about universal vote by mail states. Universal vote by mail. Every registered voter is mailed a ballot for every election, right? Currently, Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Utah, and Washington are the only universal vote by mail states not changed because of policy as a response to COVID-19, right? Again, California is transitioning to a universal vote by mail model and plans to have it implemented by 2022. Again, I believe it's as part of an emergency declaration. California plans to host their elections entirely by mail in the fall regardless, but before COVID, there are 5 states that are considered universal vote by mail states. Oregon was the first state to adopt a vote by mail bill back in 1998. And since then, obviously, it's increased in popularity. So let's dive into the specifics. It's important to note here, again, talking about how we prepare for November and can states transition to universal vote by mail. States that did this over a period of time with very deliberate budgeting and policymaking processes designed to implement vote by mail. Oregon actually began introducing legislation in the 1980s and passed it in 1998. As another example, Colorado evolved into the model over the course of a decade or more, allowing voters and policymakers to become comfortable with the practice. So again, it's not something that you can just sort of flip a switch and do overnight for the most part. It's an extensive process, one that needs to be well thought out, well executed. But again, it just takes time to implement this sort of massive change in infrastructure and how we host our elections. So how does it work? These states conduct every election by mail. Election authorities automatically mail a ballot to every registered voter well before election day, giving voters a window of time to either return their ballot by mail or to vote in person. For example, in Washington State, this is about an 18-day period. While a large portion of voters in these states do return their ballots by mail, it's important to note that these states still have in-person options to return your ballot, including vote centers and 24-hour ballot drop boxes. According to the Survey of Performance of American Elections, 73% of voters in Colorado, 59% in Oregon, and 65% in Washington still returned their ballots to a physical location, whether that's a drop box or, for example, a local election office. So again, it's really important, regardless of where you are on the spectrum of vote by mail policy, to make sure that you're giving your voters as many options as possible for them to cast a ballot, right? Again, whether it's early voting, in person, by mail, through a drop box, successful elections are accessible elections. And so it's good to have those additional options for voters as they go to return their ballot. So once the ballot's returned, there are a few more steps in the process. The ballot envelope is received by the election authority and scanned into a system for verification, typically with automated processing and sorting machines. In Oregon, they have a centralized database which matches both the envelope barcode and signature with their records. Then the signature verification process begins. And once envelopes are separated into their precincts, they're then opened and processed. Ballots are While ballots are processed before Election Day, they're not always tallied, which is an important distinction depending on where you live. Finally, Election Day occurs, ballots are tallied and stored, and results are reported. No excuse absentee states. So this is the category that Illinois falls into and is the most common form of vote by mail in America. There are variations across the states to allow for certain groups of voters, for example, disabled voters, to automatically enroll in a 5-year permanent absentee ballot system that automatically mails them a ballot for each election over 5 years. In other areas, localities can determine for themselves if they would like to host an election entirely by mail. In North Dakota, for example, counties can opt in to vote by mail systems opt into universal vote by mail systems for their elections if they so choose. So again, even within the umbrella of no excuse absentee, there's a lot of variation depending on where you live. For these states, early voting periods and in-person voting is still utilized heavily, right? Voters must request a ballot through their election authority, but no excuses required. A voter is then mailed their ballot, and the process is very similar to the rest of the universal vote by mail process. One of the main differences, however, is in infrastructure. As I've noted, universal vote by mail states tend to have a little bit more technologically robust infrastructure in how ballots are processed and tabulated and sorted and signatures are verified. For a lot of no excuse absentee states outside of major municipalities, a lot of this work's done by hand. So when we talk about how if states can scale up quickly to universal vote by mail, and do we have enough time to prepare for November in that way? It's that back-end disconnect of technology that makes it difficult, right? Unless you have the right amount of time and the right amount of money to invest in that system. On the map that I showed you, I'd also included the no excuse absentee permanent mail ballot option category. These are states that allow citizens to opt in to automatically receive a mail ballot for each election. These states, including California, Virginia, Arizona, Montana, and a handful of others, again, are likely the states with the most capacity to transition to universal vote by mail, again, as California plans to officially do over the next few years. The last system we'll talk about here is excuse absentee, generally considered the most restrictive in terms of voting by mail, right? In these states, voters must provide an excuse as to why they cannot vote in person on or before Election Day. And of course, these states also tend to have lower levels of absentee ballots cast. And most of the processing work is done by hand with election officials and judges. Someone who is an Indiana native, I remember being away for college for a number of years as I was voting, and my excuse was always, I'm a student and I'm away at university. So that was my excuse to vote absentee. But again, generally considered the most restrictive in terms of voting by mail. It's also the second most common form of voting by mail in the United States. And again, I would also note, however, that it's important to acknowledge that many states who have excuse absentee systems through the course of their primaries and leading up to November have either changed or relaxed some of these rules, right? For example, Kentucky is known to have fairly restrictive voting laws. For their primary, however, every voter was provided an excuse to vote absentee, which, if I remember right, was quote unquote public health, and would not need a witness signature to validate their ballot. So a lot of these states have addressed these sort of ballot accessibility issues. But again, as I said, there are still 6 states that are requiring an excuse to vote absentee come November. So the other thing to think about with voting by mail is disinformation and misinformation, right? This is one of my favorite political comics. You might remember the North Carolina 9th District scandal from a few years back. And if you've been paying any attention to the news or social media or you've read the paper, you've probably heard, whether it's from the current administration or from certain special interest groups, that allowing people to vote by mail would result in widespread fraud, citing concerns, ballot harvesting, hundreds of people just sitting in their living rooms filling out ballots, kids going mailbox to mailbox and stealing ballots. Generally just that allowing more Americans to vote by mail will result in widespread voter fraud, and that the election would essentially be a sham. The fact of the matter is that I can't say this quickly enough, There's nothing to base any of these claims on. Voter fraud in general is already incredibly rare in the United States. Universal vote by mail states continue to have some of the most secure elections in the country and report an exceedingly low amount of fraud cases. There are a few reasons for this. Election officials have built in a lot of safeguards into how we vote absentee to ensure that it's a safe and secure way to vote. So, identity verification, so providing sensitive personal identifying information to obtain your ballot or envelope, signature verification, voter-specific barcodes on each ballot envelope, ballot tracking, secure drop boxes, post-election audits, and finally, polling sites as a fail-safe. As an example, Oregon, who has conducted their elections by mail since 2000, has sent out more than 100 million ballots and only documented about a dozen cases of proven fraud. That's 100 million ballots and about a dozen cases of proven fraud. That's less than 0.00001% of all votes cast. A different analysis found that in all states between 2000 and 2012, only 491 cases of absentee ballot fraud had occurred. Again, these claims that one, voter fraud in the United States is widespread, or that giving people the opportunity to vote by mail in the United States will result in widespread voter fraud are not based in anything resembling reality, and to be honest, are just used as a scare tactic to try and convince people not to vote by mail, or turn it into a partisan issue, which it isn't. Again, accessible elections are successful elections, and everyone should be absolutely confident in their ability to cast their ballot by mail. Another claim that has been thrown into the arena is that casting ballots by mail disproportionately helps Democrats, and if we allow people to vote by mail, then Republicans will never win another election. There is no basis to this claim either, as both Democratic and Republican election officials support these systems. Kim Wyman, who's the Secretary of State for Washington State, is a Republican, as is Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland, who supports vote by mail. Utah, a historically red state, has been using vote by mail for years. In a recent study conducted by some researchers down at the University of Florida, the neutral partisan effects of vote by mail evidence from county level rollouts, researchers found that mail ballots did not seem to have an effect on either party's turnout, did not seem to have an effect on either party's vote share, and that modest turnout increases are similar to previous findings. So again, I just want to unequivocally state here that claims that voting by mail increases voter fraud, or that it disproportionately helps one party over another, are not based in anything resembling reality. Again, if you decide that you want to cast your ballot by mail, you should feel absolutely confident in the safety and security of that option. Okay, so are we prepared for November? We've walked through how vote by mail works as a system. We've walked through misinformation, disinformation, and we walked through the primary. And that made us consider all of these things leading up to the passage of SB 1863. So are we prepared? I think we're in a good spot. Again, on May 22nd, the Illinois legislature had passed SB 1863 Amendment 5, which contained a host of electoral reforms. These included Election Day as a state holiday for schools and state workers, which is a big benefit because it gives the ability to open government buildings and schools for polling locations. Again, large facilities that have a lot of room inside of them gives election administrators the option to really spread people out, right? I'm thinking to states that were holding primaries not too long ago, using athletic stadiums was a really popular option if they could swim, right? So it gives you the space to social distance. Another reform that was concluded was all eligible voters who have voted since 2018 or who newly registered to vote / update their registration information would automatically be sent a vote by mail application. Those went out August 1st. It mandated the creation of a central online vote by mail application portal on the Illinois State Board of Elections website. It also promotes voting by mail through a comprehensive public education program, which is really where advocacy groups like ourselves have sort of found ourselves and seen where we can fit in and help you vote. It expanded early voting hours, so 15 days out from Election Day, gave longer mandated office hours. Polling locations must follow Illinois Department of Public Health guidelines, encouraged the recruitment of younger election judges with advertising in high schools, community colleges, and universities, as well as promoted curbside voting and the use of collection sites. So a ton of reforms baked into this bill to help us prepare for November. Of course, there were a few things that we would have liked to have seen in the bill that we didn't, and so there are things we're still watching pretty closely, such as language access and provisions. They weren't explicitly stated, as well as a limit to the ability that election officials can shrink the election day footprint, which means how many physical polling locations you have on election day. But again, the advocacy community has been working very closely with local election officials to make sure that we're addressing all of these issues. And I will say that sort of the relationships that have been built between election officials and advocacy organizations to make sure that the November election goes off as smoothly as possible has been really heartening to see the amount of collaboration that's there. Finally, I would also need to mention that all of the reforms in this bill sunset as of January 1st, 2021. So they all roll back. But I think this leaves the door open for us to continue to advocate for good electoral reforms far past November. So that's what's happening at the state level. What is happening at the federal level? So we're only 49 days out from Election Day, but over the course of this year, the real focus of advocates was federal funding, right? The one thing that election offices can always use more of is money, whether it was investing in equipment, whether it was investing in cleaning supplies, whether it was having more money to recruit more election judges and retain them. Election officials and advocacy groups really saw the need for additional federal funding. Now, the CARES Act was passed in March, which distributed about $400 million of Help America Vote Act money out to the states. But it's worth noting that experts were saying that we needed around $4 billion in funding nationally to really address a lot of these problems that we're talking about. So that's one piece of the federal puzzle. The other piece of the federal puzzle is the United States Postal Service. At its core, the United States Postal Service is designed to be a public service. People depend on it for their medications, their paychecks, businesses depend on it for commerce. It's ingrained into our everyday lives. So when attacks are levied against the Postal Service in an attempt to undermine voter confidence about the validity of this year's election, it's incredibly concerning. As I'm sure you've been following, the United States Postal Service is in a dire financial situation. Now, the origins of this actually go back to about 2006, when Congress passed the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act, requiring the Postal Service to, quote unquote, create a $72 billion fund to pay for the cost of its post-retirement healthcare costs, 75 years into the future. Again, that's the creation of a $72 billion fund to pay for the cost of its post-retirement healthcare, 75 years into the future. No other federal agency or private corporation has to do this. So just think about that as we think of the situation we find ourselves in today, and the incredibly unnecessary burden that Congress placed upon the Postal Service. So again, fast forward to today and through a long battle to privatize the United States Postal Service, and we arrive at the Postal Service combating COVID-19, combating an increase in packages sent through the mail because of COVID-19, and Postmaster Louis DeJoy, who continually, up until a couple weeks ago, institute measures meant to cut back on costs, quote unquote, when in reality they disrupted nationwide mail delivery. These included eliminating overtime for postal workers, limiting the number of mail trucks, and removing hundreds of sorting machines from facilities. Trump himself has also threatened to hold back funding to limit mail voting, and nothing about this is settled. Now, as of August 18th, DeJoy did announce that any new policies were being suspended between now and November. But make no mistake about it, the Postal Service is under threat. So I want to emphasize here, the Postal Service is essential not only to the everyday running of this country, but also in allowing Americans to safely and securely vote this fall. Again, 5 states and the military have been utilizing extensive or universal mail voting for years. So don't believe the disinformation that says it isn't secure. So what should be done? In a new COVID relief package, Congress needs to fund the United States Postal Service, right? Some estimates say a $25 billion price tag is the right amount. The arbitrary changes in workplace policy also need to permanently end, as they directly impact the ability of mail to be delivered in a timely fashion. So call your elected officials in DC, sign petitions, and just generally get the word out that we have to defend the United States Postal Service. So how does all of this affect you, a voter in Illinois? Before we dive into some of these specifics, I do want to throw some numbers at you quickly. On September 9th, the Illinois State Board of Elections tweeted out that they had already received 1.45 million absentee ballot requests statewide, which is about 300,000 in Cook County and 360,000 in Chicago. In 2016, to put this in perspective, in 2016, statewide, there were only about 370,000 votes cast by mail total. Again, the State Board of Elections has already received 1.45 million absentee ballot requests statewide, and in 2016, only about 370,000 votes were cast by mail. It's a massive increase, and people are buying in to the accessible way to vote in the fall, which is voting by mail. So, what does this all mean to you, the voters? There are a couple different buckets that people fall into. First, if you voted in an election from 2018 to 2020, you should have already had a ballot application mailed to you. Those went out on August 1st. That being said, if you didn't wait to apply for your ballot, that's also fine. Again, one thing that election officials have said to us time and time again is make sure you're encouraging people to get their information and their materials in early. If you fall into the category of someone who has not voted between 2018 to 2020, you will have to submit a ballot application. There are a few options here. You can either go straight to your election authority's website, which is more than likely for the attendees of this call, a county clerk's office, so either Cook or Lake County Clerk, and submit the application. Or you could use the portal that the Illinois State Board of Elections has created, which will then guide you to your election authority's website. If you aren't registered to vote right now, or you need to update your registration information, your registration can serve as your application for a mail-in ballot. It's my understanding that people who register or update will have the option to check a box declaring that they want to apply for their ballot. Additionally, the Secretary of State's office will follow up with those who have received their mail ballot application but have not yet submitted it. And that touch happens twice, I believe, once once in the middle of September and once in the middle of October, depending on when you requested your ballot. Okay, so that's a few different universes of voters as vote by mail applies, right? So regardless of what universe you fall into, once you have submitted your ballot application, ballots begin to be mailed out about 40 days before Election Day, which is September 24th, so only 9 days from now. So how about return methods? The first, obviously, is mailing your ballot back to the election authority. Again, what we've heard from various election officials, whether it's Cook County or the Chicago Board or Lake or Will or Kane or wherever, is that they prefer that people get their ballots in ahead of time, right? The earlier that you get your materials in, you're confident who you're voting for, you know how you want to fill out your ballot. You do that, you send it in. The earlier you send it in, it gives the election authorities more time to process the increased volume of mail ballots, which just generally lowers the burden on our election offices. So again, getting your materials in ahead of time has been sort of the overarching advice from election officials here in the state of Illinois. Depending on what your county or Board of Elections, depending on where you live, decides to do to prepare for November, there might also be the opportunity to return your ballot via secure Dropbox, which we'll talk about in the next slide. So that's voting by mail. Finally, in-person options are still available. This is really important, right, as we've talked about before. Early voting hours have been extended for the general election, and Election Day voting will still be happening. Illinois Department of Public Health guidelines will be mandated at each polling location, but you should always, if you do decide to go and vote in person, whether it's voting early or voting on Election Day, always be sure to check your county clerk or Board of Elections website for the most up-to-date information, just in case a polling location might be moved for whatever reason. Again, always feel free and confident to check your county clerk or Board of Elections website for the most up-to-date information that they might have. So drop boxes and early voting. This is for Suburban Cook. Lake County doesn't have a map up yet, as far as I know. However, Lake County does have an uploaded PDF of the list of all of their drop boxes for November. So if you reside in Lake County, that information is out there, again, on the Lake County Clerk's website. So this is a map of all of the drop boxes for Suburban Cook County. Suburban Cook County is going to have 50 locations for drop boxes. And drop boxes are a secure way to return your ballot and are emptied at the end of every day. In Suburban Cook, early voting begins October 19th, and at select locations October 7th. Again, if you're interested in returning your ballot by drop box or through early voting, and are interested in the addresses of the drop boxes, or in the hours that you can go to early vote, or in the addresses of where you can go to early vote, the best place to get that information is your county clerk or board of elections website. They will have the most up-to-date information and the most accurate information possible. So again, if you have any questions that I can't answer as part of this presentation, I would absolutely encourage you to visit your county clerk or board of elections website for the most up-to-date information on how you can safely return your ballot or vote in person, depending on how you decide to cast your ballot. So some important dates as we wrap up our presentation here, some important dates to think about that are not that far away, again, with only 49 days to go until Election Day. September 24th. As I said, in-person early voting begins. This typically begins at the election authority's office. And then ballots are also mailed out starting September 24th if you've already requested it or applied for your ballot. So September 24th, again, 9 days away, ballots start going out to those who have requested them. October 18th is the last day for online voter registration. Again, after the 18th, Illinois has same-day voter registration, so don't feel like you can't register to vote. You absolutely can, but October 18th is the last day for online voter registration. October 29th, mailed-in applications must be received by your election authority. On November 2nd, that's the last day to apply in person to vote by mail. And November 3rd, again, is Election Day, only 49 days out. So again, some important dates to keep in mind as we get closer and closer. We're halfway through September. November 3rd is not that far off. So make sure, regardless of how you decide to cast your ballot, make sure that you have a plan. And again, visit your county clerk or board of elections website for the most up-to-date information to inform that plan and how you plan it. Some action items. If anything that I've said here concerns you or has prompted additional questions, some action items to think about. If you're worried about funding for the Postal Service or federal funding for elections, contact your congressperson and call your senators. Demand that our elections be funded federally. Demand that they protect the United States Postal Service. If you haven't checked your registration status in a long time, or you haven't requested a ballot yet, go to your either county clerk or board of elections website, where you'll be able to find all that information and make sure that your registration status is up to date. And if you haven't requested your ballot, you can fill out the ballot application form. If you have questions about early voting hours, or is your county going to have curbside voting or drop boxes, contact your election authority. Again, whether it's through the website or calling their office, they are the best place to go to get the most up-to-date information and help inform your plan about how you plan to cast your ballot. If you're interested in volunteering, a shameless plug for the work that Common Cause does, we run an election protection program where we work with volunteers either as in-person poll monitors to serve as a resource to voters on Election Day or through early voting. We're running a new program with social media monitoring, where people can help us monitor social media channels to identify areas or communities on Twitter or on Facebook that people are talking about issues with voting on social media. So there are a lot of different ways that people can get involved around election protection. And if you're interested in volunteering, we would absolutely love to help. It's a huge program that we're very proud of, and we're just starting to really kick it off and start the training. So if you're interested in volunteering, definitely reach out. Protectthevote.net is the way to get signed up for that. And finally, the last thing I will mention here is, if you feel confident about voting by mail and you want to talk to your community about why it's important that people request their ballot early and they get their ballot in early, or why they should feel confident using the drop box, write a letter to the editor, to your local paper. We do a lot of education, a lot of voter education here at Common Cause, but we can only be in so many places at once. So the more materials that we can get out there, the more information that we can get out there, and show that public will is really behind expanded vote by mail and making sure that our elections are as safe and accessible and secure as possible, the better off we're going to be. So again, if you feel so compelled, writing a letter to the editor is a great way to get that message out there and sort of be involved in the discussion in your community and in Illinois more broadly. So I threw a lot at you in somehow only 43, 44 minutes. So we will go ahead and open it up for questions. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tyler. And just so folks know, the information that Tyler presented there, I will include it in a handout that will be emailed to everyone who registered for the program this evening, along with a link to the recording. So that will probably come out tomorrow once the video is up on YouTube. And yeah, let's start with, let's see what question we have in the chat box here. So we have a question. Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy's office was very helpful when I called and alerted one of his aides to my concern as a constituent about the efforts at the federal level to decimate the viability of the United States Postal Service in discharging its responsibility to handle the use of mail in elections. Okay, so someone who has had a positive experience reaching out to one of their elected officials, that is great. I've got Karen. I'm going to unmute Karen now.
Hi, Tyler. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I learned a few things. And
Good.
I'm wondering, and don't get me wrong, I'm not criticizing, the news agencies do this too. But why is it that they always say, well, Congress did this, instead of saying a Congress that was 100% controlled by the Republicans in the House and the Senate with a Republican president did this? Because that's what really happened in 2006. None of the Democrats were involved. And I think, especially going into elections, we kind of need to know which party is for fair and free elections and which party is putting out the gobbledygook. So we know, as informed voters, where we prefer to vote. So do you understand why they don't do it and why? I mean, you kind of did it a little bit in your cartoon. It inferred.
Right. So I can't speak to other organizations and news agencies. One thing I will say is that Common Cause is decidedly a very nonpartisan organization in the nature of our work. And so something that we do have to be very careful about when we're talking about these issues is making sure that we're walking the line of presenting the information in a nonpartisan way, which becomes very difficult, as I'm sure you know, in an increasingly polarized and partisan world. I do think, to your point about having a more well-informed electorate, it is a good point, right? And calling out those who are responsible for decisions and for actions that have deliberately starting in 2006 and over the course of the last 14 years, weakened the United States Postal Service as an institution. And so I think it is very important to hold those in power, whether it's currently or at the time when a bill was passed and a policy decision was made, to hold them accountable. And I think, again, to your point, in making sure that we have a more well-informed electorate and a more well-informed understanding of who is responsible for X, Y, and Z policy actions. I think that is, again, a good, an important step, a vital step in recognizing who was in power and who we need to hold accountable for those policy proposals and those policy sort of executions. But again, as to why other organizations or the news or the media, et cetera, don't, I wouldn't want to speak for another organization.
Thanks, Tyler. I had a question. If you could expand a little bit on, you talked about the difference between, I forgot the way you phrase it, but like counting the ballots versus processing them. Can you say a little bit about how that process works and why they don't get counted right away?
Sure. So this is actually an issue in Wisconsin right now. And again, it's like a lot of things with voting by mail. It depends on the state you're in, what the process is. So there is a difference between processing, I guess I really should say, opening ballot envelopes, processing ballots, and tabulating or counting them. In some jurisdictions, a lot of jurisdictions, you can't even open a ballot envelope before election day or before the polls close on election day. And so what it ends up doing, especially when you have an increased volume of mail ballots, is you have election judges or you have tabulating machines that are running late into the night, into the next day, because they need more time to process this. In Wisconsin, the discussion has been allowing election officials to either start opening envelopes or start processing, but not counting the results of the ballots, right? And a lot of that gets into a very technical sort of discussion on how far you let tabulating machines go. But essentially what it does is it eliminates the amount of time that it takes to actually tabulate the results on election night, right? So one of the big things you probably hear in the news now is, it's not going to be election night results. It's going to be election week results, as to what days and days for results from different jurisdictions. So allowing election administrators to start processing ballots and ballot envelopes beforehand while not tabulating them is a good way to alleviate some of that pressure and some of that time that would be necessary to process and count the ballots. Now, there are some detractors who would say we shouldn't even open the ballots beforehand because it eliminates the security of the ballot, eliminates the privacy of the ballot before they're actually counted. But again, allowing election officials to at least open the envelopes or to begin processing but not fully tabulating the ballots would be a really good way to make sure that there's not a huge delay in reporting election results, because it is going to take more time. More people are voting by mail, and we'll just have to be patient. But that's sort of a little bit of an examination of the difference between the process of processing and then actually tabulating the ballots.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about Karen's point, in terms of the media, I just can't imagine. I mean, election day is such a they are making the predictions right away. So I just wonder how much confusion that's going to cause, or how responsible the media is going to be in reporting, if things aren't actually tabulated.
Right. And so that's another interesting point, actually, is making sure, and part of this falls to the advocacy community, and making sure that the media is as informed as possible about how election administration works, right? Because one, every state is different, and even within states, every county can be different. Local authority is huge in the election administration world. And so it's sort of incumbent upon us as advocates to not only do public voter education, but also work with the Chicago Tribune and the Sun-Times and whoever else to make sure that we understand that even if it takes an extra day or two to report ballots or to report the amount of votes cast and who they've been cast for, that's not a failing of the election system. It's the system working. They're just taking the time to make sure that it's an accurate count and that it's done well.
Thank you. Any other questions out there for Tyler?
Karen raised her hand again.
Yeah, because I did find one thing confusing on one of the slides. It was the one where you had the dates, and it says you can actually register in person to vote by mail the day before. I mean, my God, if you're here in person, can't you just vote the following day? And how in the world could they get your mail-in ballot to you and you mail it back in time? That just seemed a little odd. And I mean, I took it at face value, but I don't really understand it.
You'll notice that I'm smiling because I mean, I don't know. So theoretically, if you were going to apply in person for your vote by mail ballot, theoretically they would give you your ballot there with the envelope, if I'm not mistaken, and then with the new election law here in Illinois, your ballot has to be postmarked by the end of election day, and then I believe it has a 2-week window to make it to the election authority to be counted, right? So the time is still there. Of course, I would definitely encourage people not to wait until that deadline to then go request a mail ballot in person to then try and get it within the 2-week window after election day that it can be received. But yeah, technically the window of time is there if that's how you choose to vote. But again, I would absolutely encourage, if you decide that you want to cast a ballot by mail, do it early, get your application in early, get your ballot in early. So you have the peace of mind that it's been received and counted, and so the election authority has the time to process it and tabulate it and manage, again, that increased volume in mail ballots.
Yes. All right, looks like we have Steve. I'm going to unmute you now, Steve.
Thanks. What is the Federal CARES Act, number one? And number two, what is the chance of the provisions, Tyler, that you talked about that sunset January 1, 2021, being continued beyond that date?
So I'll start with the CARES Act. It was federal funding, one, of the $400 million of Help America Vote Act money, which was passed years ago, but through grant funding, there's still money that's doled out to the states through legislation. And so the CARES Act was passed with the intention of providing additional funding to election authorities, right? They're, again, paying for additional recruitment of election judges, right? In Chicago, I think they make like $240 or something to serve. So you're recruiting additional election judges, you're paying for additional cleaning equipment, you might want to buy a high-speed tabulator. So again, it was meant to sort of provide this windfall of funds, which again at the time, and I think we still find this today, that most everybody said was not nearly enough for what we needed at the time. But that's the CARES Act. For the provisions that were passed in SB 1863, I think among the voting rights advocacy community, after November, I think that'll probably be the baseline for what we want to see in Illinois, right? And I think a lot of it will depend on how the election goes, right? It'll depend on how long it took to report the results. It'll depend, were there long lines in early voting or on election day? Was there enough personal protective equipment? But again, I think that this bill has sort of set the baseline for what voting rights advocacy groups will accept moving into the future, and sort of will inform our advocacy moving forward. Again, I think for a lot of this legislation, once you've introduced it, people tend to really like it. People really like having different options in how they can cast their ballot, especially again when it's more accessible, when it's more convenient. So I think after this election, there's going to be a lot of public support for these reforms. Again, I think it's going to be sort of the baseline of where we come from as advocates. Now, as far as the timeline, I wouldn't even want to start to guess with how the legislature has been in Illinois and the craziness that is COVID-19 and how you legislate. But yeah, I think, again, it'll be the baseline for how we move forward in advocacy and what we're asking for and rallying people around. And again, I think public support's going to be there to back up these reforms, again, at a minimum.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to end on. We are at time today. I think that, the point is kind of that it's kind of in our hands, right? I mean, Tyler and Common Cause, they do a lot of work, advocacy work, but they also are giving us tools to advocate for ourselves as well. So if you, think that those reforms should, continue past this election, then, contact your local officials, maybe volunteer with another advocacy group like Common Cause, and make your voice heard. So yeah, thanks so much, Tyler, for presenting. And thanks everyone for attending tonight. And like I said, this has been recorded. You will get an email with a link to the recording along with a resource handout that'll have some of this information included in it, and also a survey to let us know what you thought about the program. So thanks, Tyler.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.
Have a good night.